G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the second series of the History in the Bible podcast. More of the history in more of the books in all the Bibles. Episode 2.43, Palm Sunday. In the last episode of History in the Bible, I concluded my story of Jesus' late ministry, as Jesus wended his way from Galilee to Jerusalem. We now reach the climax of Jesus' life, where he will achieve glory. This final week of Jesus' life is known as the Passion, from his entry into Jerusalem unto his death. If you read the Gospels carefully, the many parables, teachings, and miracles of Jesus they tell are usually delivered in small, discrete chunks. They are pearls on a string. Most tales only last a dozen or so verses before the next. You could shuffle these anecdotes any which way, and that is exactly what the evangelists did. They plopped them into their narratives to suit their own purposes. The Gospel writers often differ on the order of events and where these events take place. The Passion story is nothing like all the other little stories told of Jesus. The Passion is the longest narrative in all the Gospels. You can't reshuffle it. The last week of Jesus' life stands as a unified chronicle. For this reason, most scholars think that the Passion was the first story about Jesus put into writing. The evangelists relied on oral traditions for the parables and the sayings and the miracles. Only for the Passion did they have a cohesive written source, now lost to us. Let me begin by summarising the story I will relate in detail over the next few episodes. Jesus has become famous for his teachings and healings in Galilee and beyond. As a good Jew, he travels to Jerusalem for Passover. Passover is the most important of the three great pilgrimage festivals in the Jewish calendar. Passover and the following Festival of Unleavened Bread is an earnest but a joyous week-long celebration of the Exodus from Egypt. Jerusalem is packed to the rafters with tourists. The Romans have reinforced their garrison to maintain crowd control. Jesus enters Jerusalem a few days before the Passover, on the day that Christians call Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday is the first day of Holy Week, or Passion Week, the most solemn and hallowed time in the Christian calendar. The crowds acclaim Jesus' triumphal entry, singing hosannas. Jesus cleanses the temple, lashing the money changers. The temple authorities plot against him for this abominable blasphemy, and for the popularity he has gained by raising Lazarus. Jesus spends a few days delivering parables, an entire apocalyptic discourse, and some wholesome teachings at the Mount of Olives. In these stressful days, Jesus is soothed by Martha and Mary, sisters to the risen Lazarus. After a final dinner with his students, Jesus retreats to the Garden of Gethsemane. He prays to God to spare him from the sacrifice that his Father demands of him. That is where the temple authorities find him, thanks to intelligence supplied by Judas Iscariot. The disciples flee. Jesus is arrested. He is tried before the council and before the Roman governor, Pilate. Although Pilate finds no fault in Jesus, he allows the Jews to persuade him of Jesus' guilt. Jesus' right-hand man, Peter, denies him 3 times. Jesus is taunted and crucified amidst ominous supernatural events. Friends of Jesus inter his body in a tomb. So much for the summary. Now let's go through the Gospels, one by one. Let's begin with the wacky Gospel, John. The Gospel of John devotes half of his book to the Passion. He devotes almost a third of his book just to the last day of Jesus' life. You could read the Gospel of John as a passion narrative with a long introduction. John's chronology of the Passion is nothing like the Synoptics. John must be using a source for the Passion unknown to the Synoptic Gospels. John says that Jesus spends 6 months in Judea before the Passion, conducting great signs and annoying the authorities. Driven beyond endurance, these authorities send Jesus to his death. The Synoptics hold that Jesus spends but a week in Judea before his death. John also has a quite different timetable for the last week of Jesus' life. Now, onto the Gospel of Mark. Mark expends 6 chapters, a little more than a third of his short Gospel, on the Passion. Mark includes a chapter known as the Little Apocalypse, similar to the Big Apocalypse we all know, the book of Revelation. Mark does not avoid the horror in Jesus' death. Jesus dies naked, mocked, abandoned, and in agony. Mark quotes the Old Testament to show us that Jesus' death was foretold as God's will. Mark's story is riddled with dramatic irony. Now, here's what I mean by that. Mark's readers always know more than the characters in Mark's story. While he is on the cross, Jesus is mocked by the Romans and Jews as King of the Jews. But the reader knows that Jesus really is King of the Jews. He really is the Son of God. At the moment of Jesus' death, Mark says, the temple curtain is ripped from top to bottom. Mark's story ends on a cliffhanger. Mary Magdalene, another Mary, and Salome arrive at Jesus' tomb. The tomb is empty, and that is it. Roll credits. If just the Gospel of Mark had survived, we would only know that Jesus had been resurrected by reading the letters of Paul. On to Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew spends 8 chapters and about a quarter of his Gospel on the Passion. He fleshes out Mark's account. For a start, Matthew adds an account of Jesus' resurrection, an event notably lacking from Mark. Matthew throws in a few bonus parables, most of them in the 5th and final of the great speeches he gives to Jesus. Matthew rails against the Jews. Matthew loves parables and really hates the Jews. But he really tops himself with the infamous passage about the blood cry, where the Jews accept the guilt of Jesus' death upon themselves for all time. To the drama in Mark, Matthew adds an earthquake and the dead rising from their tombs. And finally, the Gospel of Luke. Luke is the least fixated on the Passion. Luke takes only 4 chapters to tell the story. Luke takes a decisive turn from Mark's narrative. He throws in a trial before Herod Antipas and a second appearance before Pilate. In the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, Jesus is a tortured soul on the cross, terrified of death. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus faces death with serenity. The Synoptic Gospels are in broad agreement, with the odd big bump, such as Luke's edition of a whole new trial before Antipas. But though they agree in large, the Synoptics often disagree on tiny details. One example is the declaration of the centurion, Ioannis Vanias, who witnesses the death of Jesus. In Mark, the centurion ironically derides Jesus with, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." In Matthew, the words are heartfelt, not mocking. In Luke, the centurion declares Jesus innocent, but not the Son of God. Now, I've summarised the plot of the Passion Week and shown how each of the Gospels tackle the story in their own different ways. Let's get into the specifics. The Passion story begins with Jesus at Bethany, a suburb on the southern outskirts of Jerusalem. Bethany is the hometown of the risen Lazarus, and his sisters Martha and Mary. Bethany will also be the place where Jesus ascends into heaven. In the Synoptic Gospels, Bethany is Jesus' last stop in his journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. Jesus directs his disciples to commandeer the ancient equivalent of a stretch limo to make his grand entrance. Here is Mark. Quote, Mark 11:1. Jesus sent 2 of his students and said to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find tied there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it." They went away and found a colt tied near a door. Then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut in the fields. Then those who went ahead and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." End quote. You have to wonder if Mark is taking a leaf from the second book of Maccabees. Now, why not settle back of a salamander sandwich and refresh your memory about that book by listening to my episode 2.12, Grappling with the Greeks 3, the Maccabeans' Revolt. Second Maccabees describes the victory of Judas Maccabeus over the Hellenes like this. Quote, Second Maccabees 10:7. Therefore, carrying ivy-wreathed wands and beautiful branches, and also fronds of palm, they offered hymns of thanksgiving to him who had given success to the purifying of his own holy place. End quote. Sound familiar? No? Let's turn to Matthew. The author of Matthew loves to find Old Testament references. He decides that the triumphal entry was predicted by Zechariah, who wrote this. Quote, Zechariah 9:9. Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. End quote. Zechariah uses the typical biblical Hebrew practice of paralleling a thought by saying it twice with different words. Zechariah is poetically reinforcing his own words. Matthew reads Zechariah's poetry as literal. Matthew says that Jesus rode on 2 animals, a donkey and a colt. Quote, Matthew 21:1. When they had come near Jerusalem and had reached Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 students, saying to them, Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, just say this, the Lord needs them, and he will send them immediately. The students did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt, and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. End quote. Scholars disagree as to whether Matthew was a Jew or not. This misinterpretation of Zechariah's Hebrew suggests that Matthew cannot have been au fait with Hebrew poetry. Those who believe that Matthew was a Jew riposte that we have plenty of evidence that most diaspora Jews had lost their knowledge of Hebrew. Buoyed by his rapturous welcome, Jesus marches to attack the temple. Herod's temple was the largest structure constructed in the Roman Empire until the Colosseum, built by the Emperor Vespasian 80 years later. Impressive for such a small kingdom. The temple was the great pivot around which rotated the Jewish religion of the day. The temple was not, like St. Peter's, a place of worship, but a place of sacrifice. The temple was the only sanctuary the Jews could righteously conduct the sacrifices demanded for the great festivals. The temple precinct was also the symbolic home of the most powerful political class in the land, the priests. The temple was the White House, Supreme Court building, and the Capitol combined, or Buckingham Palace and the Houses of Parliament all in one. There were plenty of Jews who thought that the temple was corrupt, the Pharisees and Essenes amongst them. But they had to concede that the temple was the embodiment of the Jewish state and the paramount seat of power. The Gospels describe Jesus' attack on the temple briefly. Jesus alludes to the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah. Quote, Mark 11:15. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, Is it not written, My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of robbers. And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. End quote. We are meant to be outraged. Jews are defiling the house of God. Let's take a step back. Way back in episode 1.17, Leviticus 1, God's barbecue, I talked about the sacrifices that God required of Jews. God was especially keen on blood sacrifices: sheep, goats, oxen, pigeons. The very essence of being an observant Jew required constant sacrifices to God, and the best sacrifices were blood sacrifices. When the Jews lived in a purely pastoral economy in the early Iron Age, pretty much everyone could bring along a goat for sacrifice, and a pinch, maybe cattle. By Roman times, Judea was full of urbanites who had never owned a goat in their lives. Pigeons may have been all over the place, but have you ever tried to catch one? The temple precinct was a menagerie. You could not buy the sacrifices with grubby pagan currency. Pious Jews had to exchange their filthy lucre for godly coinage. Armed with these holy shekels, Jews could then righteously present themselves to the priests and purchase holy blood sacrifices. Jews felt that they were carrying out their pious duty to God by exchanging filthy lucre to praise God. Most scholars are very confident that this is one of the few events in Jesus' life that we can really be sure is historical. Judea had been racked by factional violence for 2 centuries. High priest against high priest, kingly pretenders against each other, Jewish factions against the Hellenistic rulers and against Rome. After the death of Herod the Great, when Jesus was a child, Judea was plagued by uprisings and ethnic strife. For more on all that, have a listen to episode 2.20, Herod's Heirs. The Gospel writers knew these stories from their parents. The evangelists also lived through the Jewish attacks on the Hellenes that took place across the eastern Mediterranean a decade after Jesus' death. The Gospels tell us over and over that throughout his ministry, Jesus rejected the violence that had become normalized in the Jewish society of his time. This one single act of ferocity is so out of character for Jesus, most scholars say, that it must be a reliably preserved memory. The Gospel writers could not suppress this one aberrant incident to preserve their depiction of Jesus as the picture of calm and peace. Jesus' attack on the temple was too widely known. The Gospel writers, even though they were writing decades after the event, could not ignore it. The Gospels entwine the cleansing with the miracle of the withered fig tree. Quote, Matthew 21:18. In the morning when he returned to the city, he was hungry. And seeing a fig tree by the side of the road, he went to it and found nothing at all on it but leaves. Then he said to it, May no fruit ever come from you again. And the fig tree withered at once. When the students saw it, they were amazed, saying, How did the fig tree wither at once? Jesus answered them, Truly I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only will you do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, Be lifted up and thrown into the sea, it will be done. Whatever you ask for in prayer with faith, you will receive. End quote. Rather an odd little miracle, don't you think? More of a curse, a metaphorical attack on the Jewish establishment. Perhaps the infancy gospel of Thomas picked up on this story. That gospel was written a generation after the last books of the New Testament and remained a bestseller for 1,000 years after Jesus' death. In this typical story from the infancy gospel, Superboy Jesus extracts retribution on a child who spoils his fun. Quote, Infancy Gospel of Thomas 2:1. And the son of Annas the scribe had come with Joseph. And taking a willow twig, the son of Annas destroyed the pools and drained out the water which Jesus had gathered together. And he dried up their gatherings. And Jesus, seeing what had happened, said to him, Your fruit shall be without root, and your shoot shall be dried up like a branch scorched by a strong wind. And instantly the son of Annas withered. End quote. Yes, well, for more on the infancy gospel of Thomas, check out episode 2.33, Epiphany Special, We Three Kings. Jesus has cleansed the temple. The establishment intrigues in secret against this outrage. In public, they try to ensnare Jesus in a theological trap. They demand to know by what authority he justifies his outrage. Jesus enlists the Baptist to his cause. The historian Josephus relates that the Baptist was a popular hero, universally regarded as a man of exceptional piety. You never diss the Baptist. Quote, Mark 11:29. Jesus said to them, I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin? Answer me. They argued with one another. If we say from heaven, he will say, Why then did you not believe him? But shall we say of human origin? They were afraid of the crowd, for all regarded John as truly a prophet. So they answered Jesus, We do not know. And Jesus said to them, Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things. End quote. And so Jesus has turned the tables. The Gospels tell us that in the few days before his death, Jesus preaches some industrial strength parables. These attack the Jews who are about to reject Jesus. His parable of the tenants and the vineyard is interpreted by Christians as a blueprint for the church's replacement of Judaism. In the parable of the two sons, Jesus praises those who repent and condemns liars and hypocrites. In the parable of the wedding feast, Jesus likens God's kingly rule to a wedding feast whose invited guests spurn their gracious invitations. In the same few days, Jesus tussles with the Jewish leaders. In one dispute, the Gospel of Mark pointedly mentions Jesus' opponents as Herodians. They ask him about taxes. Should we pay Roman taxes? That reference to Herodians is a callback to the revolt of one Judas, no, not that Judas, who led an insurgency after the death of Herod the Great, when Jesus was an infant. Judas was a one-issue rebel. His platform had but one plank: no Roman taxes. The Herodians are trying to tar Jesus with the brush of the rebel. Jesus slips out of their trap by declaring the Jews should render to Caesar that which is Caesar's. In all the synoptic Gospels, Jesus whacks the scribes at every chance. He calls them arrogant and entitled. They defraud widows by soliciting cash for prayer. 2,000 years later, you can find an endless number of Christian preachers who took the scribes' business model to heart. The Gospel of Matthew is most rabid in its condemnation of the scribes. Matthew cranks his volume up to 11 with this speech from Jesus. Quote, Matthew 23:15. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the sanctuary is bound by nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the sanctuary is bound by the oath. You blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the sanctuary that has made the gold sacred? How blind you are! For which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And whoever swears by the sanctuary swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by the one who is seated upon it. End quote. Jesus now repairs to the Mount of Olives, or Mount Olive. This is a large hill just east of Jerusalem, across the Kidron Valley, barely a kilometre or half a mile from the temple. There he launches into an extended discourse on the end of times. This is often called the Little Apocalypse, in contrast to the Big Apocalypse, the Book of Revelation. The Little Apocalypse is strikingly different from anything else in Mark. Most scholars incline to the view that it was an independent pamphlet written during the Roman war that erupted around the time that Mark wrote, in the late 60s. Mark swiped it for his own purposes. The many apocalyptic books floating around in the century or two before Jesus lived envisaged God's destruction of the Roman ungodly as a sudden shock and awe annihilation. The pagans would be quickly vanished. The righteous children of Israel would wake up one morning to find their province a Roman-free paradise. The little apocalypse of Mark crushes those hopes. There will be no mission-accomplished banner flying over the temple. To the contrary, Mark says, the entire world will suffer, Judea included. Jesus declaims, long quote, Mark 13:7. When you hear of wars and rumours of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes, there will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one on the housetop must not enter the house to take anything away. The one in the field must not turn back to get a coat. Woe to those who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not be in winter. For in those days there will be suffering, such as not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now. No, and never will be. After that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven." End quote. The little apocalypse also warns against listening to false prophets. Quote, Mark 13:5. "Then Jesus began to say to them, 'Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, I am he, and they will lead many astray. And if anyone says to you that at that time, look, here is the Messiah, do not believe it. False messiahs and false prophets will appear and produce signs and omens to lead astray the elect." End quote. Mark ends his account with Jesus warning his followers to be watchful. Now listen to what Jesus says about himself and his Father. Quote, Mark 13:32. "But about that day or hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. And what I say to you, I say to all, keep awake." End quote. In this passage from Mark, Jesus clearly distinguishes himself from the Father. Jesus has no idea what God intends. The other evangelists gagged on that. Surely Jesus and God were one. The evangelist Luke covers his ears and pretends that Mark never said such a thing. Many, but not all, ancient manuscripts of Matthew take the same attitude. In the next episode of the History in the Bible, I move on to that most poignant of stories, the Last Supper. Thanks for listening. For maps, charts, and diagrams, check out my website, www.historyinthebible.com.